Okay, we're going to read chapter 11 now of Cracker, the Best Dog in Vietnam by Cynthia Kadohata. When we read chapter 10, which is fairly short, we know that the dog teams, including Rick and Cracker, flew for many hours across the world in a C-130 cargo plane to, to Vietnam, and they've landed at an airport called Tan Son Airport. And Rick had checked Cracker's nose to make sure it was wet because that's a way to tell if a dog is healthy or not, if they have a wet nose. And now we're going to start and read chapter 11. Here's the actual way Tan Son is spelled. Tan Son was a sprawling airport in Saigon. Rick crowded at one of the two small windows up front, trying to see over some other men. Down below, he just caught sight of the jungles, rice paddies, hills, and in some places, neatly planted rows of trees. Sarge, right at the next window, stabbed at the window pane. French-owned rubber tree plantation, he was saying. The French colonized Vietnam before World War II, but the Vietnamese kicked their butts in 1954. As Rick understood it, Vietnam had been one long, narrow country. In 1954, the Geneva Accords divided it into two countries, North Vietnam and South Vietnam. The North Vietnamese were communists. The South Vietnamese were not. The goal of the United States in this war was to prevent South Vietnam from going communist. One of the soldiers' goals was to make contact with as many enemy soldiers as possible and to kill them. In the Army, contact meant contact with the enemy, as in firing at or being fired at by the enemy. The 67th IPSD would be convoying to their final base camp in Bien Hoa, located in what was called Three Corps. The United States was conducting an air war in North Vietnam, but the ground fighting was only in South Vietnam. The United States had divided South Vietnam into 4 military regions. Three Corps was second from the bottom. Rick looked around to see what the other men were doing. Most were pushing at the few windows, but Cody sat in the deuce and a half sleeping. Unbelievable. Rick couldn't hear him, but he knew he was snoring. Cody sometimes snored so loudly that the sergeant had decided he might be dangerous during nights spent in hot zones in Vietnam. Hot zones were areas where the enemy was active. The noise of Cody snoring might alert the Viet Cong to the American presence. Bruno was so protective of Cody that he wouldn't let anybody near him during the nights. So out in the field, Cody was always supposed to sleep with a rope tied around each leg. One rope attached to the other end of Bruno, and one stretched out so that someone could pull on it if the snoring grew too loud. That way, you could pull on Cody's leg and wake him up without getting too close to him, that Bruno would get protective. Rick yawned because of the time change. It seemed like it had been daylight forever. But there was some commotion at the window. But the guys in front of him pressed so close he couldn't see a thing. Is that the Viet Cong? Someone was saying. The Viet Cong were guerrillas. Rick's father had explained all this to him with the same kind of seriousness as when he first told Rick about the girls and all that. He'd even drawn diagrams both times. By definition, a guerrilla was a kind of soldier, one who fought a stronger opponent, in this case, the United States, by stealth and sabotage. The guerrilla fighters hid in the jungles blended in with the civilians and even lived by the thousands underneath the ground in elaborate tunnels. Sarge was saying now, you rarely see Charlie unless he's lying on his back dead. Sometimes you imagine you see him, though. Sarge turned suddenly and pointed to one of the big tires of the deuce and a half. Rick turned quickly to where Sarge pointed. Is that Charlie behind the tire? No, it's just a shadow. Bam, bam, bam. Sarge feigned getting shot. Nope, that was Charlie after all. In addition to fighting the Viet Cong, the Americans were also fighting the NVA, North Vietnamese Army. But the NVA wore uniforms. The South Vietnamese Army was called the ARVN, for the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. Most of the enemy contact in Rick's area would be against the Viet Cong, who used booby traps as one of their main weapons. The traps were psychological as well as physical weapons. Sarge said that if you let the traps get to you, then fear of stepping into one haunted every step you took. There could be booby traps everywhere, and that's what the dogs were for, to find the traps before any soldiers stepped in them. Tan Son was both the American military air base and the civilian airport for Saigon. As the plane landed, Rick managed to get a glimpse of something on the tarmac. It looked like a red, white, and blue platform of some type. He wondered whether there was going to be some kind of welcoming ceremony. He couldn't wait until Cracker got out of the plane and into the fresh air. But when the troops opened, instead of fresh air, he felt a great wave of wet heat. All the guys leaned back at once as if the heat had pushed them. Still, Rick eagerly unloaded Cracker's crate and set it on the tarmac. He leaned his nose against the gate and felt the dog's wet nose push against him. Cracker, good girl, he said. He heard laughing behind him and turned around. Some soldiers he didn't recognize were shaking their heads at Rick and his pals. New guys, one called out laughing. Give your doggy a kissy. Rick played it cool, ignored him. This was a Scandinavian specialty. As he looked around, he saw what he thought was a welcoming stand. It was actually a pile of caskets lined up, 4 high, with flags draped over them. A couple of guys were already picking up one to take it onto the plane that Rick had just gotten off of. U-Haul said, "Get ready to whip the world, soldier." Rick didn't answer at first. But hey, if he mouthed off, what were they going to do? Send him to Vietnam? So he said to U-Haul, "Can't they wait until we're gone to do that stuff?" He deliberately left off the sergeant. He already felt a little less like a new guy, a little more like a rude guy his grandmother had seen. U-Haul put his face in Rick's and said, "This is a war." Then he shouted to the men, "Empty that plane, double time." They moved fast, climbing back on board to empty out the plane and make room for the caskets. Okay, so I wanted to show you a little bit about what we just read about in chapter 10. So looking at the presentation, there's a picture of some of the examples of the jungles of Vietnam, and they were thick. There's a lot of bamboo, and these are the lower areas. There's the ground, and there's a little water in the background, and the guys would have used a large knife and machete, and they had to hack their way through and make the paths. And on these paths, that would be where some of those booby traps were located that they were talking about. This is an example, was supposed to be an example of the early plantings of the rubber trees, and these are looks more like a vineyard to me, but this is the baby trees, I guess. I don't know. But they were planted in neat rows, and that's how you knew. I'm going to show you a little piece of a video clip about how rubber is extracted from these trees at rubber plants. Or latex, it's actually what it is, guys, is it's the sap from this tree is used, boiled and cooked down to make latex rubber, which is used to make all kinds of things like tires, the rubber gloves that you wear, anything that's made out of, that has any component of rubber in it, pretty much comes from this Asian countries, these Southeast Asian countries. And they tap these trees, and it looks, they call it white blood. But I wanted to show you just a little bit of this clip about how they do this. It's very similar. Well, no, it's a little bit different than how you would get maple syrup, because they just drive a nozzle in the tree like this one right here and let the sap come out at the fall of the year when the sap's running. But this they do a little bit differently, and I'll let you look and see how the guys are doing it. Whoops.
Welcome to All Farm.
And there's the trees, and you can see this guy's going to show us how he taps a tree, and he's taking a knife. It's just latex, he says, mainly in the form of latex. It's pouring water where it's rained out of there. And they make like some kind of little cut with this knife in the bark of the tree. like tapping the tree, just like we do when we get maple syrup or maple from the tree. We do it in the early morning hours. And they collect this little strap, they call it, and I'll show you how he does that. And when he cuts it, it kind of causes the tree to leak sap, and it runs down this little valley of the thing and drips into this bowl. That's why he has to take that knife and clean the other out. It kind of unstops it. It's like having a scab on your wound that stops the bleeding. He takes the scab off, and there's what the knife looks like. It's got that little curl in it that captures that. Protects the bark so you don't damage it. And when that scab forms, that stops the flow of the latex and protects the tree. And there's certain types of containers you have to put it in. You can't put it in copper, iron, or brass. You have to put it in plastic or aluminum, they said. It can be kept up for 3 hours before it starts to coagulate. That's like scab up. That's what it means. So that's what they're talking about. Okay, and in that chapter, Rick was talking about how when they got off the plane, he saw all those things out on the tarmac. The tarmac is what you call the blacktop road that the runway. And that this is an example of what that might have looked like. All the soldiers that are killed, that are shipped back home, their caskets are draped with an American flag, and then they're loaded onto these cargo planes and shipped back home. And this is an example of how it's done. It's done with honor. They talked about, we already watched that. They talked about, we already looked at this. We talked about these underground tunnel systems. They talked about that. So let's watch about this tunnel rats.
Tunnel rats, the Vietnam War. The communist forces began digging tunnel networks in South Vietnam in the late 1940s during the First Indochina War against French colonial rule. By the Vietnam War in the 1960s, the tunnels had evolved into a complex system of hospitals, storage, kitchens, and headquarters. The NBA and Viet Cong went underground into the Cu Chi tunnels when the U.S. forces bombed the area. As well as providing shelter, these tunnels helped the NBA and Viet Cong launch sneak attacks and ambushes, as well as lay booby traps close to enemy positions. To clear out these dangerous tunnels, brave infantrymen from Australia, New Zealand, South Vietnam, and the United States volunteered for this unenviable job. They would gain the nickname Tunnel Rats. The soldiers chosen were usually short, at 5'6" and under, as they could fit in the claustrophobic conditions. Initially, dogs had been used. However, this did not work as they could not detect booby traps. Grenades or tear gas can also be used to flush out the tunnel. However, this could alert the enemy or destroy intelligence. The tunnel rat would be lowered down head first by his fellow soldiers and have to stealthily move around in the darkness, navigating the dark tunnels armed only with an M1911A1 pistol, a flashlight, and a knife. He would listen for any enemy movements, followed by a second man who would radio to the surface to map the tunnels. The M1911A1 pistol and its large 45 caliber round caused a blinding muzzle flash and a noise in the confined space, which could temporarily cause deafness, so tunnel rats would improvise their own suppressors or use a civilian revolver sent from home. As part of these search and destroy missions, the tunnel rats would search for enemy intelligence and place C4 charges on weak points, so the tunnel could be later destroyed. Inside, they could encounter booby traps, such as punji sticks or released snakes and scorpions, before they even found any enemies. Poison gas was also found in these tunnels, but tunnel rats often risked not wearing a gas mask as they restricted vision, hearing, and breathing. If they encountered the NVA or Viet Cong, the tunnel rats were instructed not to fire 5 to 6 shots in a row, as it would tell the enemy that they were about to reload. Overall, the job of the tunnel rat was stressful and terrifying, and could see a man's nerves break in what was one of the most dangerous jobs of the war. Subscribe for more Vietnam.